Good morning, gentlemen. Could I start with you, please, Mr. Lynch? Coming from the perspective that I fully accept and respect that your job is to stand up for your members, to get what you believe to be a better deal for them. Of the multiple days of strike action that have taken place so far this year, and that there's clearly potential for many more to come, what's your assessment of how much money your members have lost through strike days?
Well, it depends what they earn, and it depends whether they're on strike every day. We haven't got a ready-made figure, but they do lose their wages for every day that they're out on strike, and it depends on what shift they're on, how long that shift was, and what rate they're on. What I do know is that the government is subsidising those strikes. We think £30 million. Every time there's a strike, the taxpayer has to pay those companies £30 million. So there's no incentive for these companies. They've got no capital at risk. They suffer no loss. And instead, the DfT and the Treasury pays them to conduct this campaign of aggressive action against our members, to cut their jobs and freeze their pay and rip up their terms and conditions. So the greater scandal is how much money the government is transferring to these private companies in lieu of the revenue that's being lost. So that's why we believe that they're taking so long to come up with proposals.
Okay, I appreciate that answer, but I'd really like to focus on the human beings that work on the railways, them as individuals that want, and you, I think I've got a quote from you from last June, that the British worker needs a pay rise and job security. Well, fundamentally in these times I agree that pay rises and job security are fundamentally good things. But to go through a process by which there are now so many days of strikes, I think I would like to try and understand a little bit deeper, putting aside the points you made about subsidy to train operators, how much money those individual human beings are now down this year on average, or maybe segment them down into different job types as a result of strike action.
Well, I haven't got a figure because it depends what you do. It depends what job you've got, how many days you work, whether the strikes are on the day that you are rostered on. So I haven't got a number for you. If you're expecting me to turn up, perhaps we could have calculated that in advance. But it will be a lot of money if you've been hit by the dates that we're on. But what we do know is that our members are fully committed to the action, because they don't want their conditions ripped up that we've negotiated with these companies and their predecessors. And of course, you can only get a pay rise if you've got a job, and Network Rail and the train operating companies are proposing thousands of redundancies. And at the same time, as you've just heard, they cannot run the railway without vast amounts of overtime. And the previous Secretary of State said he was going to ban overtime on the railway, which just is an illustration of the incompetence and lack of knowledge that is at the heart of what the DfT does. Because as soon as people don't want to do overtime, the railway collapses. So what we need is a proper agreement. We need the right number of staff. We need the right number of people in training, so that there's a supply train of qualified staff coming through. And we haven't got that because these companies are only in it for the money they can get, not for the service that they can provide for our people.
Thank you for that answer. Can I just delve into this point about job security? That is very important to me. There are many constituents of mine that work on the railways and many other sectors, and job security is vitally important. We've seen through the pandemic massive change in rail use. Clearly in the pandemic people weren't travelling, and as we've come out of it, patterns have changed significantly. I've seen analysis that suggests that whilst the overall numbers are broadly back up, people are travelling at very different times and for different purposes, and some analysis suggests that that's leaving a roughly £2 billion hole in finances.
Well, £2 billion reduction in government funding.
We can look
That's
at it.
What's happened.
We can look at it whichever way, but with people aren't buying the peak time tickets as much, and they're travelling on the cheaper off-peak tickets and weekend tickets, that has an impact on the bottom line. I've seen some analysis that suggests that's around 2 billion.
It hasn't affected the bottom line because they've continued to make profit due to subsidy.
Well, we can come
so
on
it hasn't
to
affected the bottom line of the companies
at all. I'm very happy to come on to
all.
the profit point later, but I just want to look at this point that if the railways are bluntly to survive, they need people buying tickets to travel on them, the way people are choosing to buy those tickets and to travel does appear to be changing, either through home working, either through more weekend travel, leisure travel rather than work travel. Does the RMT accept that in order to secure everybody's jobs within the railways, something does need to fundamentally change in terms of making the railways attractive to people to buy tickets again, and having uncertainty over whether the train will be running in the first place is equally driving people away from the railways and back into their cars or coaches or whatever it may be?
I think you're absolutely right. The railway does need fundamental change, but it's not the one that the railway companies are seeking. We need a railway that runs in the interests of the people, in the interests of the economy and the environment, not in the interests of First Group and others who are subject to private equity takeovers because they're so attractive. The changes they wish to make to strip out wages and conditions are so that they can make increased profits going forward, and they're doing that at the behest of the Secretary of State and the previous incumbent in that job on an ideological basis. So what we need is lower fares. We need an incentivisation for people to get out of their cars and onto the railway. They won't do that with the current fare structure and the current industry structure, and they won't do that with the industry structure that's proposed under the Shapps White Paper for Great British Rail, because you'll keep the corrupt system of railway privatisation where there is no risk, where these people have got a one-way ticket to profit, as you've just heard, where even if they score 0 on customer satisfaction and are unable to run the trains at all when there's no industrial action because they've declared war on the staff and on the passenger, they will make profit no matter what happens, because that's the structure that's been put in place. So we need fundamental change, yes, but you don't need to attack the staff.
What do you believe was the average profit margin for a railway operator pre-pandemic?
It's quite low, but there's no risk. There's no risk to them at the moment.
Do you accept the 2% figure?
Probably 2%, but if there's billions of pounds in circulation, that is quite a comfortable living. If I was getting 2% of all railway income, I'd be doing quite well. And so normally businesses have to put capital at risk, don't they? Yeah. That's why they justify their profit. Well, this is a cartel of people that are working with the government to produce surpluses at no risk to themselves. Yeah. And no matter what their reputation is in this industry, the government will keep paying them. That is ridiculous, and I might put it, a corrupt system, because there's no incentive for them to make any change. The TOCs have taken £3.5 billion worth of profit out of the railway since privatisation. They haven't done anything for us because they've got no risk. And when they've had risk, they've handed back the keys.
Mr. Lynch, I would like to get into this profit point, because I think these figures are disputed. I've seen things from your union that talks about £500-600 million profits, and yet there is equally data out there that suggests since privatisation, as you've raised it, that passenger numbers in fact doubled on the railways and have reduced roughly a £2 billion annual operating loss. And some of your figures don't seem to take into account the rolling stock costs and the supply chain.
They do, costs. And the rolling stock companies are making vast profits. Last year, when there were virtually no passengers, they made £150 million worth of profit.
We will disagree on whether profit is a good or a bad thing, I'm
Profit's
sure.
okay,
However,
the return of risk.
I'm trying to understand, for the evidence base of this select committee, where the real profit is, because there is a lot of analysis out there that suggests the real operating profits of the railways is likely to be post-pandemic somewhere between 100 and 150 million pounds. Now, I'm sure we'll agree that that is a lot of money, but that translates to about a 2% pay rise for 1 year, not the sort of numbers that we're talking about. So,
well, how does it translate to a pay rise? They could make the pay rises without getting rid of their profits. And you've got to ask the question, why are they in this business at all to make profit? We don't need private rail operating companies that we've got with LNER and several other operators who couldn't cope. We don't need the incentive of private companies.
Understand, you just said that they could make pay rises without impacting their profits. So where else is the money going to come from?
It doesn't necessarily wipe out all of their profit, but I would be very happy if we had no private sector rail operators and we could pay the staff a proper wage.
Okay, my last question, and I'd be grateful for a brief answer to give others a chance to answer it. What will you accept in terms of change on the railway, either through greater automation or technology coming in to ensure that costs can be reduced on other things other than what we pay the human beings that work on the railways in order to secure job security?
Well, we've accepted change constantly in my lifetime on the railway. We've had new technology constantly, whether that's retail of tickets, whether it's the technology on rolling stock, or whether it's the technology on repairing the track. And we are constantly in dialogue with Network Rail about that. What we won't accept is a decline in safety standards, where they're going to cut 50% of the maintenance standard tasks, where they want to make our people work permanent nights, which we think endangers them, and they want to make our people have a work-life balance that is entirely unacceptable. So what we will accept is a negotiated change and an evolution of the railway. We won't accept a massive imposition where they will require us to work overtime constantly because there aren't enough people there anymore, and where they will sign, for instance, they've just signed a new deal with the private sector infrastructure companies for £13 billion while they're looking to make their own people redundant. So what we will accept is a negotiated change to our agreements, not an imposition.
Thank you. I've tipped over my 10 minutes, but I thank you for your candor.
Great, thanks very much. Straight over to Graham Morris.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to ask Mick a couple of points of clarification. Then I want to ask about the Felix. So I'll come to Miles in a moment. I don't know if you were in. I think you were for the earlier session with Tim Shovelin, and he said he was. Well, I'm paraphrasing. He said he was kind of optimistic that it might be possible to get a settlement. He said he sensed some kind of change in the atmosphere. What's your perception, from the RMT's point of view, and can you elaborate on the role of the Secretary of State, because the previous one and the current one, is their sign-off vital to securing any agreement?
Well, I'm not sensing a massive change. You have to be optimistic in this game, otherwise, both sides of the table, otherwise you'll never get a deal. So we are working with them. Both sides understand fully what is needed. And at the moment, their recipe of change is not acceptable to my union. So we don't get on to money. Everybody's asking about money, what would you accept? In most of these negotiations, we don't discuss money at all, because the menu they're putting in front of us is not acceptable to our members, and people ask, why didn't you put this or that to a referendum? If we'd put the last offer from Network Rail to a referendum, I suspect it would have gone down by 8 to 10 to 1. Our members are clearly not ready to accept what they're proposing. The changes in their lives that they're proposing are so dramatic that they will sink without trace if we put them to a referendum. So that's where we are. We'll keep working the problem with them, but they will have to back down, frankly, on some of the demands they're making to us. In terms of the Secretary of State, well, the previous one just kept abusing me and everybody else and calling me a baron and all this business and a militant. And I don't think the people that support us, the people who are out on our picket lines, are a bunch of militants. I think they're men and women who want a square deal off their employer. What it needs is a new atmosphere. They've cut the funding. They've cut it on London Transport as well, which is why we've got difficulties there. It's $4 billion in total. So we could settle these with a bit more funding. People don't want to hear that, but if you're cutting money, you have to put up with the consequences, and we're hearing that all over the economy. But creating a different atmosphere is helpful. So I know that leading people, Sir Peter Hendy, the chief execs and various others have been to see the Secretary of State, which is good. I hope they get a new mandate. I think it's strange that Steve Montgomery isn't here today answering questions as to what his role is as the chair of the RDG, and the person who's running Avanti directly. Why they've sent somebody who claims to know nothing about the disputes is beyond me, because they could have got direct knowledge on that. So,
to be fair, that would be my fault, because I didn't actually invite him in that sense. So we wanted to hear about Avanti's operations and Network Rail's negotiations. So
he's running the operations of Avanti at the moment. So it's helpful that there's a different mindset, I suppose, and a different approach, and it's helpful that she's met us. But we have to see something at the negotiating table that changes the formula, the paradigm, whatever the posh word is, that we're going to take forward. But at the moment, we haven't seen it.
Thanks. I wonder if I might go to Miles. So we've heard that the basis of the dispute isn't primarily about pay as far as Network Rail goes, it's about terms and conditions. What can you tell us about the dispute at Felixstowe in terms of what is it about? Is it pay or is it also terms and conditions?
Well, in a sense, I for once find myself agreeing with Paul Davey insofar as it is principally a dispute about pay. However, it goes to the strength of feeling which it's revealed goes to years of industrial relations going back a long way. But I think it's notable that this is the first dispute at Felixstowe for 30 years, right? So this is principally economic in its origin, and it's a local dispute, which is people. To reiterate the point that Mick has just made, these are about as far from militant people as you could possibly ask. I mean, they live in a constituency of Teresa Coffey, and some of them are voting for her. So they're hardly rampant militants, right? They simply feel that they've been given a deal they can't live with, and they need to do something to improve their pay.
Can you elaborate on the current position in terms of negotiations with the employer? Because I was rather confused when I heard the response from Mr. Davey.
Well, the response from the employer is that they've withdrawn completely from negotiations and won't talk to us. And the only way they'll talk to us about 2023 is if we completely cease all campaigning and being a trade union, really, in every respect, and then they might talk to us, which has been their position all the way through, which is kind of, their way of framing it would be, we can't negotiate with a gun to their head, to our heads, but when we take the gun away, they don't change. So we have made clear throughout that we're ready to talk to them at every juncture. This is a company which is awash with money. We can talk about exactly how much profit they made through the COVID period, but it's in the hundreds of millions.
It would be useful if you could, because I did ask Mr. Davey about the profitability of the company, and he said I don't think he disagreed with the figure of 200 million.
That's right.
But in terms of justifying the claim on behalf of your members, what is the position of the company? It's profitable. What were the shareholder dividends over the last few years?
I don't know the exact levels of shareholder dividends, but they're very high. Okay, in terms of the hundreds of millions figure, to settle this dispute would cost a tiny fraction of that, and we've been clear throughout that we want to settle it. Recent events, particularly the company's withdrawal from negotiations, it's difficult to conclude otherwise that the company seem to want to keep the dispute going, and with all the attendant disruption to the economy.
I'm just wondering about the role of government in settling the dispute, because clearly Felixstowe, it's a local dispute, isn't it, and a company that's had very good industrial relations over a long period of time. Whereas the rail dispute, it's a national dispute involving employees from Network Rail and on the train operating companies. Is there a role for government in settling the dispute at Felixstowe?
Well, you'd have thought so, wouldn't you? Because there's a deal to be done without a doubt, and nobody could seriously suggest that they can't afford to do that deal. And if you look at the cost of settlement versus the cost of keeping it going, it just doesn't stack up, and you have to ask the question: why are they doing this? Who benefits from this? So if as I've said all the way through, we are ready to meet with them to settle this dispute, and it can be solved very simply. We in fact did signal to them that we were prepared to reach a, if you want to call it, a compromise. That was turned around on us and used in the most appalling manner, in my view. I won't go into the details because I don't talk about individuals, but it shouldn't have been done. And I think I'd like to make one other point. Anybody who suggests that this dispute has somehow been timed to coincide with Liverpool or anything, that is absolute nonsense. It's arrived here because of the company's reluctance to settle, and it started because of a survey of our members of what they considered a fair pay rise. So, and every decision is made by our members. No doubt you're going to ask me about balloting.
What were the figures in the ballot?
Well, the original one was 92% of those voting. I think it was an 80, I can't remember exactly, 80-something turnout. So, I mean, that's by any standards a pretty respectable mandate, isn't it?
Sorry, Graham. Hasn't one of the branches of Unite at the port accepted?
Yes.
That the members have accepted?
Yeah, that's the managerial branch. And I hope that indicates to you, because that's what it should do, that nobody is twisting their arm to do something they don't wish to do. That's that the members make all the decisions, and the fact that that branch made a different decision on the facts they had available to them indicates that they're free to do so, and that's been the case all the way through, despite the company, suggesting otherwise at every opportunity.
Sorry, Graham, back to you.
I was just going to conclude, Chairman, by asking first Mick and then Miles, what do you think about the government's plans to legislate to compel trade unions to put an employer's offer to the membership at the expense of the union?
Well, I think it's ridiculous. I don't think it'll work. So that will incentivise an employer to make a daft offer. So inflation is currently 12.3, I think, on RPI, and a bit below that on CPI, whichever you want to take. So if an employer turns around and says, here's 1.95%, can you put it to your members, knowing that it's going to go down like a lead balloon? You do all that, then you go back next week, they go, well, how about 1.975? And you go back and do that. I don't know how this will work and how any employer would then come to the table in an atmosphere of goodwill, as we always say. I know these old trade union cliches, but you know when you're going into a room where an employer wants to do a deal, and they know when we want to do a deal, and it's not masquerade or whatever, showboating. But nobody will no employer would want to do a deal on that basis. They can just make the union keep going back and back, spending more and more resources, and it will be a distraction. I mean, every party knows when there's a deal going to be done or when you've got the basis for developing a deal normally, and you don't need all that distraction. And I think it just indicates people who don't really know what they're on about in terms of industrial relations and running businesses.
Just coming back to that, Graham, if you... Or did we put that to Miles yet? Sorry.
Well,
Sorry, beg your pardon.
Why I was interested is because of the imposition of the 22 award.
Well, Mick's exactly right. I mean, anybody who's ever been involved in negotiation of any sort will know that in the course of a meeting you might throw 10 ideas across the table and bat it around. Now, how are you going to measure what an offer is? And it's absolutely ridiculous. But in the case of Felixstowe, as I say, you've got to remember that all the decisions have been made by the membership. Okay, so when that 7% was offered, we said they're not going to accept it because we got reps in every department and they talked to our members and they know what was coming back. And they said, you've got to put it to your members. Made a huge play of this nationally, in fact, and then they imposed it. So we had to put it to our members, right? Because we had to ask the question, do you accept this or do we just stop now? And far from saying we accept it, they rejected it by another whacking great majority of 83 or 82%. So what turned out to be the case was that what we were saying was true. We had the temperature of the workplace and we knew what it was, and we were trying to do what was best for good industrial relations. And instead, the employers now imposed it and angered people no end. And actually, again, as I've already sort of stressed, they've inflamed the dispute rather than made an effort to solve it. So I don't think it's going to work.
Thanks.
Thanks, Graham. Just coming back to your point, Mr. Lynch, I mean, why would a company put a ridiculously low pay offer out there and think that's good practice? Because all that will happen is that it will get rejected 100% and give the unions the whip hand. So I don't quite follow the logic of what you were just saying as why companies would do that.
It would incentivise companies to keep making the unions go back to voting and wasting our time rather than negotiating a settlement. But with the raft of other things, and you've mentioned this earlier in the session about when a company can impose, and what they can say is that they've moved to the end. They have to say that they've moved to the end of the machinery; it's been exhausted, which is what happened with VTEC, and we won that case against Virgin Trains East Coast, the predecessor of the current holder, because they hadn't exhausted it, and it's illegal at the minute to impose if that hasn't been exhausted. And there's a case called Costall. So I think the legislation that they're seeking to bring, we obviously have to see it before you can make a judgment on it, will end up with all of us in court quite a lot. And there'll be winners and losers on that. But what they're essentially trying to say is that effective industrial relations will be suppressed in this country, and it will be extremely difficult to have a ballot every time you've got an offer that may be particularly puny. And let's not forget, in the train operators, we haven't got any offer at all. You'd have to keep going through these exercises, which I think
I agree it would be deemed
knots.
a waste of time, but a business wouldn't necessarily want to give you the whip hand and waste the time. And to your point that actually you can't legally define an offer, but actually by its very concept it's a legal definition. I was a negotiator for some years, and I would be able to define what would have been a negotiated offer. So I don't share your scepticism that it wouldn't work in practice, even though I understand why you wouldn't actually want
it would
to
work for the business, wouldn't it? That's the idea.
Well, it could also work for your members. We obviously heard when we had the session with your deputy and Mr. Shoveler earlier that 8% pay offer had just been made. Do you not think it would have been reasonable at least to put it to your members and just determine whether they were willing to accept that, or if, as you say, they wouldn't, then you've got your proof and you've got your negotiating arm?
Well, we did put it to our members through their elected reps. I mean, that's what you do in the chamber.
No, I mean to all
Isn't that what you do in this chamber every day? Are you going to put the Chancellor's budget to a referendum?
Well,
you're going to put it to elected reps.
No, we don't.
They'll make the decision.
No, not at all. We all actually have our vote. That's the whole point. We don't. We don't
and
give it up to anyone
so do
else.
our reps when we have a mass meeting.
No, but what about all of your members?
Well, what about all your constituents? Will they vote on the budget? Or will you let their elected representatives
the next
vote on
election?
Well, obviously, if we work on every basis like that, then we'll be in Switzerland. But, where the railways may work.
We would have exactly the same situation in the union. We've got multiple companies. We deal with 400 companies in the course of a year. Unite must deal with 4,000 or 5,000, for all I know. We'll be running around running referendums on a non-stop basis.
Following your logic, why do you bother putting anything to the members at all then?
Because we get to a final position that may be at the point of either agreement or impasse, and we go to them for their endorsement. I mean, we didn't put every version of the European treaty to the country.
We've
long
tried
debate about that.
We tried it once. Say to that.
Exactly.
Just coming back over to Mr. Hubbard, just to be absolutely clear here. So the 7% was rejected, but I don't know if you heard me mentioning this to the representative for Felixstowe. Your national officer, Robert Morton, said that he was looking for a figure of between 7% and 12.3%. What was offered was 7% plus £500, which seems to be within that window. So is there anything else that's actually...
I think what he was saying was that the current offer was one end and the inflation was the other, and the answer lay somewhere between. I think that's how I'd interpret him to mean. But he
said... A figure between 7% and 12.3% would be acceptable.
Yeah, there you go. So he's saying that...
He wasn't commenting about the inflation rate, he was commenting about the...
Well, the 12.3, because the wage claim is for 10%.
Yeah, so I recognise it's a big window, but you're sort of within the window, that was the point.
Well, our members make that decision, all right? So, as Mick has already sort of shown, I think what all this is predicated on is a belief that we, our members don't trust us. There's no trust in the room. Everybody's out to, act badly, and there's never any agreement. Well, that's most of the time. There is agreement. These, I mean, particularly at Felix, I can't speak for the RMT situation, but most of the time we reach agreement on things, and have done for the last 30 years, right? So, by and large, there is trust and the system works. Sometimes it goes wrong, but, just somebody said earlier about all these days of strikes. If you compare it to 1979, it's a minuscule amount of strike action taking place. There's, it was tens of millions of days lost. So, we've got to get this in proportion. Most of the time, the bargaining system works well and leads to harmonious industrial relations. And it's only these anomalous situations which look...
And just help us, again, you touched on this with Graham, but we heard from Network Rail that they felt that they couldn't impose their pay offer onto the workforce. We heard from Felixstowe that they took the view that because negotiations had ended, that they actually could, and that gave them the legal differential to justify it. You're saying that the negotiations only ended because they wouldn't continue to negotiate with you. How do you and your lawyers sort of view the position?
Well, that one remains to be seen. So we'll find out, won't we? But yeah, I mean, in terms of common sense, when one side says we have not finished negotiations, you'd think that would pretty much be clear, wouldn't you? This was. I mean, I don't want to go into the details of this because it will be argued out in due course. But Unite has been clear all the way through that we wish to bargain, we wish to get back in the room, we want to make a deal, and we're prepared to, to look at all possibilities on that. But our members can't live with what's there at the moment. That's, to me, is a reasonable position.
With respect, Chair,
negotiation by its definition is not a unilateral concept. So I take your point. Sorry, Mr. Lynch.
You are putting a case where it's purely money. So one side's offering 5 and the other one wants 9. So logically, you might get a deal with 7. But all the negotiations we're having with the train operating companies and Network Rail are on the verge of fire and rehire. It's all about conditions. It's all about the number of people that are going to work there and what the work-life balance and the nature of that work will be in the future. And what they're saying is, if you don't accept what are basically new contracts of employment, we are going to make the redundancies and we're going to impose the changes. And that is like fire and rehire. And if you don't want that, you might have to take it to a tribunal as an individual or as a group. And we never get round to the money, because the money is at the end of the equation. We're constantly stuck in what's your working life going to be like. And P&O made a different decision. They didn't want to discuss it at all. So for our members, it's absolutely fundamental what their life is going to be like. And the TOCs have said to us, everybody will be on a new contract of employment. So that's all the Sunday issues and all the premiums and all the stuff that we've negotiated. They want a new model contract, without the detail because there's hours of discussion, a new model contract that will be entirely different to the one you've got now. So that is a version of like it or lump it. You can either agree to it or you're going to have to take it as it's imposed with the redundancies on top.
Okay, let me open up to other members. First of all, Carl, and then Gavin. Carl.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Mr Lynch, actually you answered my question without me even asking it, because I was going to ask for some details about the negotiations and what were the sticking points, because you said it wasn't about money. But if I can perhaps sum up, would you, on behalf of your members, ever accept driverless trains? And without you immediately saying no, say for instance a 50-year-old driver was offered severance pay for driverless trains to take place, say of, I don't know, $500,000. I'm not going into negotiations with you at this point, but would you put that to your drivers, or would you just dismiss that out of hand?
Well, we don't think it's safe to have driverless trains on the mainline railway. So you would have to spend more money than Kwasi Kwarteng has printed last week to bring in driverless trains in this country. The ability to detect cattle and sheep and people crossing, we can't even work out level crossings in this country. Network Rail have not got the infrastructure. We haven't got automatic signalling, only on one route to Machynlleth, I think, at the moment. So you are decades and decades away from that becoming a question. And if you want to go up to the Highlands of Scotland and have a driverless train, you'll have a train that is stopped forever, because there's no infrastructure and this government is not going to give it any investment, even towards getting a more efficient railway system. The only real new signalling projects you're getting are on things like HS1, and there are little piecemeal bits around the system. So
you admit it works on DLR?
Well, they are attended trains, and our members on DLR drive those trains as soon as they've lost coherence with the signalling system. So there is always a person on those trains. DLR has got exactly the same crewing requirement as a London Underground train. There's a person that is capable of driving that train on it and is responsible for the dispatch. So it's not true that there's a driverless train. The person on it is a qualified driver.
Okay. Chairman, I'll go back to you because I know there's other people getting with complex.
Thank you. Straight over to Gavin.
Thanks so much, Chair. You described the current setup. I think you used was corrupt cabal, subsidised profit, etc., etc. Obviously, in Scotland, the ScotRail has been nationalised, is now under public ownership and control. And just last week, it was announced that the sleeper service is going to come back into public ownership. Now, clearly, public ownership in and of itself isn't a panacea for all the problems that you've outlined and the operators have outlined, but would you see it as a first step to potentially seeing off some of those challenges?
I do see integration, and I hope the sleeper is integrated with ScotRail services. We want public ownership in the interest of the users, but all the other issues. And I don't think we're going to get a railway that runs in everybody's interest until the profit motive is taken out of it, because they will only run the services that will pay them a direct profit unless we give them incentives through subsidy, and that's what they've lived on. So the big owners, such as First Group, which is a Scottish company, have walked away from franchises. They walked away from the Great Western Railway franchise as soon as it was going to cost them any money or get any risk. And there's been a number of people that have run ScotRail and the sleeper service that have made a pig's ear of it, frankly. They cannot do what they bid for, because what they bid for undercuts the previous incumbent, and you get a downward spiral, I believe, and then we end up subsidising it. So I do see an integrated transport policy as the future, but that's got to be where all of the railway services, including freight, are running a broader interest than the people that are pitching in for the stake. And I think that's what the problem is, that they're driving down standards rather than driving them up, because the only standard they're interested in is their own return.
And lastly, because we need to move on to aviation, if I can, Chair, the General Secretary of the STUC, Ros Foyer, said at the weekend spoke about the difference in approach from the UK government to the Scottish government with regards to disputes. They said they know that they don't have a government that will give them everything they want as fast as they want, but they've got a government that will get around the table to discuss these things, and they don't have that south of the border. How much does that differ with the approach that the UK government has had?
Well, I do think there is a different atmosphere when you meet Scottish politicians of all hues. We go up there and meet all sorts of people, and they have an attitude, I think, where they want to resolve the issue. Whereas I think sometimes when we meet politicians down here, they want to exacerbate the issue and make us, for some reason, their enemy, and make our members some kind of victim of their ideological pursuit of a free market agenda. And that's something that I think the railway suffers from.
Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, so despite all of that and the fact that Scotland has got the nationalised operation, which you would like, Mr Lynch, and Gavin, you mentioned it's a better series of industrial relation strategy than south of the border. Yesterday, I believe that the RMT, voted for strike action on ScotRail. So where did it all go wrong there?
Well, it's not a panacea. You'll still get problems. They've got budget restrictions, and they're picking up from what was left to them by Bellio, the previous caretaker of that. So I'm not saying that we will never have industrial relations issues, but I think I'd make a prediction we'll get to a solution with ScotRail in a more comfortable way than we will with the train operating companies that are governed by the DfT.
But you're on strike.
We've had 1 day of strike. We've had 8 days of strikes on the English-based ones.
Well, you might think you've only just started, unless you're actually giving the Scottish government the whip hand that you're willing to cave in.
Well, we don't have a tradition of caving in, so I don't think that's going to develop now.
I suppose that's my ultimate point and challenge to you, which is that you talk a lot about not liking the private model. We accept that. But whether it's private or nationalised, you take industrial action. So at what point, and with particular reference to the fact that does it actually make any difference anymore, is the reason these strikes continue to roll on is because what you've demonstrated is that people can carry on working from home, whereas time's gone by, I would have expected this to have been settled by now.
Can I make one point, Chair?
Can I just ask Mr Lynch to answer that?
Yeah, I think the government, the Conservative government at the minute, is making this dispute longer, the DfT one. Where the DfT are not involved and where Grant Shapps wasn't involved, we have settled all of the major disputes. So if you take driver-only operation with Transport for Wales, with Merseyrail and with others, we have settled those disputes, and we haven't got pay disputes apart from this issue in ScotRail. So there is a theme that the DfT and the Treasury have provoked some of this stuff by cutting the funding. We will continue to talk to ScotRail and Transport Scotland, and we will get a solution eventually.
And who do you think should end up paying for these increases? Is it the passenger or is it the general taxpayer?
Well, the railways will have to pay for them, and we need a settlement for the railways, a funding settlement that's going to be adequate. But at the minute, it's all being paid for by our members, either in terms of their jobs, the pay freeze that we've had for 3 years now, or the conditions that are going to be ripped up. And you can compress that spring for so long and you'll get a reaction.
Working on the basis there will be a settlement. There tends to be a settlement. So who should foot the bill for that? Should it be the rail passenger or the general taxpayer?
The bill for the railways is footed by a combination of subsidy and fare payers. But what we're not getting is the train operators chipping in at the minute. They are not forgoing any of their profits. Nor did they during COVID, and nor did the Roscoes, who continue to post record profits when there were less than 5% of people travelling. And the system this government has brought in rewards the Roscoes, who have no risk either, and it rewards the TOCs, who have no risk at all, for doing nothing, and that includes settling this dispute.
Okay, and Gavin had one last question.
It was just to say that the slight difference is the starting point of the offers from the government. So we're much closer to where the RMT want us to go. So it's 5 years, no compulsory redundancies, and there's a 5% pay offer and excess revenue share, which is what the train drivers accepted at the end of their dispute, although they are...
I recognise I'm not asking you the questions, but that would actually suggest that it's a pretty unreasonable strike if it's such a great offer. But last question, because we put this to
those strikes amongst low-paid people.
We put this
5% when you're on 21 grand is a different
to those in industry, so it's only fair we put it to you as well. So I talked to Mr. Shoveler, for example, about what more he felt you needed to do in order to actually get to a settlement. And equally, I said, what more did he and the government need to do to get to a settlement? I'll put it to you in the same way. What more do you think that the RMT need to do to actually get us there? And equally, what more should the government do? Because you can't be that far away, I would perhaps suggest.
We put to them proposals about which will address some of the stuff they want, what they call modernisation, which we sometimes call cuts. They've got those in front of them. We put these counter arguments to them, and with the train operators we do the same. But the train operators have not changed their position since 18 months ago, and in fact they've made it harder. They want to go back to all the DOO disputes which you had in your constituency and open every single one of those disputes on Northern and on all the intercity companies and go back to those arguments from 6 and 7 years ago. That's the position that the Secretary of State has given them. She needs to change their mandate at the negotiating table, and they will tell me directly, we cannot make a new offer to you until we go and see the DfT and they change their mandate. And it's in the national contracts that they've got that the Secretary of State is responsible for industrial relations at the TOCs. And de facto, she's the only shareholder of Network Rail. So it might need a few more bob, Mr. Merriman, I'm not going to kid you. Disputes get solved sometimes by more money, but it also needs a change in attitude and a change of stance. Stop asking us to accept things that they know we cannot accept.
And what more do you think you can actually give in terms of being creative?
Well, we are creative as we can be, believe me. We will, and then we have to persuade our members. But we'll do that at the table. We have put counter-arguments to them and counter-points that would address some of the stuff that they want. So whether it's on retail, whether it's retraining our people to do different deployments on the railway, we will deal with that, and we always have.
Mr. Shoveler said you hadn't put a figure that you actually wanted. Is that the case?
Because we're not at the stage of money. So the offer he's put to us is 8% over 3 years. Inflation at this time is 12.3. So he knows that's not going to cut the mustard. They never got a pay deal last year on Network Rail, and the offer is over 2 years going forward. So it's 8% in over 3 years, which is very poor. And he knows that's not going to fly, but he wants to get the changes through first. They say you have to accept all the changes without reservation, and then we might give you a modest increase on the deal that's been proposed.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Hubbard, to put the same point to you, what do you think Felixstowe could do to actually get your members there, and what more can you do in the same vein?
We know, and they know, that all they need to do is come around the table and talk about a figure we could all live with. Our members are keen to make a deal. We're keen to make a deal. They've frankly taken a very belligerent position, and I don't know why they've done that, but it's massively, disruptive. We accept that. We don't want to cause disruption unnecessarily, but our members have nowhere else to go. So our message to them is come back round the table. Let's make a deal.
And what more do you think you can give them to the same?
We can. It's difficult to know what more we can give. We can bargain
somewhere between that 7% and 12%.
Well, that's the quick look. I'm, with all due respect, I'm not here to bargain in public, right? But of course, yeah, there's a deal to be made somewhere, as Bobby Morton has been clear about.